of many to this online webinar for the Designscapes project, Designing for Inclusion, Understanding Participatory Evaluation Process Using an Organisational Social Change Perspective. So we're going to run through a presentation that presents some sort of concepts around these ideas and relates them to the overall work in Designscapes, and also presents some sort of case study examples of where participatory evaluation processes have been used, and then goes into some kind of like practical things or ways of working with participation in a wider stakeholder community. And if there's time at the end, we'll take some questions from our participants. Just to introduce myself, my name's Juliet Scott. I work at the Tavistock Institute. We are one of the partners in the Designscapes Consortium. We're a social science not-for-profit organisation based in the UK. And I work there principally in a sort of as an organisational consultancy role, and also teaching organisational consultancy on our professional developments programme, with a strong interest in bringing in the arts and culture into our work. Joe, over to you.
Yes. So I'm Joe Cullen. I'm also from the Tavistock. Mainly in Designscapes, I'm involved with the evaluation, so designing the evaluation, and I'm making sure that it's implemented. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to start off with some, why are we doing this? Why are you here? I've no idea. There's only one of you. Why is it necessary to think about participation and evaluation in the same kind of breath? What is it about? How do we actually do this stuff in practice? I'm going to use an example of how you do participatory evaluation in the real world with a project called Share My European City, which is all about drugs, alcohol, and young people. The three tend to go together. And we'll then have a look at some practical tools for doing this stuff, and some of the challenges and obstacles that you might come across if you try to do this in practice, and end with, if you're still awake, with some questions. We're not going to do the breakout sessions because it makes no sense, because there'd be half of you in one room and half in the other. All right, so why are we doing this? Well, mainly because we have to, because the Designscapes call, the program that it came from in H2020, places a great emphasis and importance on getting people involved in the design process, and it places a particular emphasis on the social inclusion angle. So one of the key objectives of Designscapes and the call that funded it was to try to make design more diverse, to actually get people who were on the margins, citizens themselves, who hardly ever get a chance to become active participants in design, get them involved, get people who are on the margins of society involved in the process, so design can then make a contribution to social inclusion itself. So that's the first point, because basically, as I've said, one of the main objectives of Designscapes is to include citizens and socially excluded people as participants in design. And the second reason that it reinforces the first one is that if you talk about design thinking, it's a lot about giving a voice to people who don't have a voice. So if you go to the Designscapes toolbox, for example, there are lots of tools in there to help implement the design process and design thinking that prioritize and emphasize giving a voice to people who are usually powerless. So that's really why we're here. I can't move now. I've kind of got stuck. Oh, okay. So we know from our analysis of the call 1 and call 2 applications, because as you know or may not know, there are 3 calls to Designscapes. The first call was about producing feasibility studies. The second was doing prototypes, and the third, which is currently ongoing, is about sustainability. So actually getting projects that have been proved and tested and trying to replicate them in the future. When we analysed the results of the applications and what the applicants were doing, we found that although social benefits were often assumed as an outcome of the projects, they weren't really articulated very well. They weren't expressed in detail. So it seems to us that although participation and inclusion is kind of referenced in what the projects that are funded are doing, in practice, we found not that much evidence that was actually happening. The second thing we found when we analysed what the projects that were funded under Designscapes was doing was that, again, although there was some lip service, if you like, to consulting with stakeholders, in practice, that wasn't happening enough either. So we wanted to try to emphasize how important it is to get stakeholders, and particularly stakeholders who come from the margins, from social excluded groups, getting them more involved in the actual implementation of the funded projects, but also in how they're evaluated. Juliet, you're going to have to move on because mine's not working here. Right. Okay, so this is our kind of holy trinity, the triangle. It's at the center is design-enabled innovation, which is what we're all trying to do, what Designscapes has been funded to do, what the projects that Designscapes has funded in the 3 calls are trying to do. On the top of the triangle is theory of change, and we've done some work already. You know, if you went to previous webinars, that theory of change is extremely important in how we configure the way projects work and how we configure and apply evaluations. So what theory of change does, it sets out the problem that the project is going to solve, the impact at the end of the project, where it's the change it wants to make, and the steps between the problem and the impact, and the steps that involve activities, outputs, and outcomes. So at the heart of the evaluation of Designscapes, and what we try to encourage projects to do, is to use theory of change to understand and plan for what change they want to make at the end of the project. The second pillar, can you have a pillar of a triangle? The second angle of the triangle is about co-production. If we're serious about using design and design thinking to promote social inclusion, to promote the wider engagement of citizens in design and how design impacts in society, then you need to be participative. You can't include citizens, you can't include stakeholders, you can't include people who are isolated from society unless you actually have a methodology and some tools to get them involved. So co-production is the second angle of the triangle, and the third is about scaling. So the theory of change gives you the evidence about whether you're making a difference with the project. Co-production gives you the engagement of users and target groups. And scaling, you use the evidence and use the participation within the project to try to scale what you've been doing out and up. So expand it geographically or in other locations, or scale it out and transfer it into contexts that are different from the context in which your project operates. You're going to have to move me on again now. We're going to get into problems when we have the animations. Is there any way we can fix this? So I think it's your turn next, Juliet, I think. Are you still with us? Or is it
I'm
me?
just unmute. No, I'm just unmuting. Yeah. Hello, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Audience. So yeah, thanks, Joe. This next part, we just thought we wanted to present some sort of theoretical thoughts and underpinnings to why why designing for inclusion. And one of the things that I'm going to just start off with is from that organizational perspective that I described at the beginning, and my practice as an organizational sort of change consultant is to give some thoughts and yeah, around organization. So in a way, there's the kind of first question is why organizational, and goes back to Joe presenting some of those findings and evidence from analysis of the applications, that a lot of the projects were looking, in fact, to make behavioral, cultural, wider social systemic change, but quite often not kind of presenting the skills or the background or the expertise in what it means to make those kind of wider organizational changes. So what this does is just introduce some thoughts around what organization is and how we look at organization in this context and how it relates to participatory working. So sorry, I've just, everyone's gone black and it's like I'm talking to nothing. Sorry, I've completely lost myself. It's weird, yeah. Completely lost it.
We're here, Juliet. We are
thanks,
here.
Alicia.
We're here. Don't worry.
Hear you, yeah.
You are not alone.
It's the new wave of our daily lives.
We are just muted because we have background noise, so don't.
But there's no video either.
Okay.
That's because we have horrible lampshades from IKEA that we don't actually.
Yeah, we switch off the video due to bandwidth issues. To be honest, I'm actually working from home today, so my connection at home is not so good, and I switch off the video.
No worries.
Okay, so some of the conceptual underpinnings. So what underpins a view of organization that kind of looks to that speaks to participation. So why participate? So I suppose what I'm trying to introduce here is that there's a different locus of and a different focus of looking to how change happens, that is emerging, I suppose, with different understandings of what organizational systems work and where the locus of change is within an organization. So these statements sort of offer really some thoughts, which that kind of show that sort of change of shift. So coming from everyone is an artist, Joseph Beuys' statement, which kind of moves away from the notion of sort of artists as virtuoso performers, who sort of, in a way, sort of stand at the top of a kind of ecosystem, or in the center of an ecosystem, at the focus of it, to much more sort of distributed senses of organization that are really kind of present in terms of the urban environment, change and activism in the urban environment. So where everyone's a participant, people are producers, they're not consumers. They're part of the action and the activism in the urban environment. So that kind of history of flanners, protests, citizens of the street. And so sort of, contemporary organizational change and thinking is, really incorporates that type of understanding and approach. So, and contemporary change thinkers like Otto Scharmer, very much thinking about change happening as participatory, as stepping back, as looking at the bigger system and working together to co-sense and co-shape the future. So this takes that sense of the organisation into the city, and a sort of representation of the city as a complex system. This is by an artist called Grayson Perry, who works in a very kind of using kind of psychology and emotions, and really wanted to use it to just introduce notions of what we might be looking at. So Joe's references to stakeholders, to participation and inclusion, he maps out the city according to very, very different sort of dimensions. And this is one of the, and the kind of where the emotions are located in the city, where the dreams are located in the city, where the thinking and the head is in the city. So I really, the purpose of this map is to sort of, introduce that sort of complexity of what it is that we're working with when we're working with questions of inclusion. And as Joe introduced the notion of theory of change, which we could also think of as a map, as an object that maybe that helps projects in moving from sort of one place to the other. Important to know then we introduce maps that the map is not the territory it represents, but it has a similar structure to the territory which accounts for its usefulness. And this is really to sort of also bring into notion the idea of complex systems where you can be working with detail, you could be working with the fractal of sort of information, but you can always be pulling in and out of that information in terms of the way that you understand the situation that you're working with. And this comes from understandings, sort of ecological and complexity approaches to social change. So what I'm trying to get at is we're sort of understanding the system as interdependence of individuals and groups as co-shaping the social. So the organisation, and so organisational change needs to be seen as a sort of set of complex responsive processes rather than something that can be changed by one action or one individual or from one locus or one particular position. So then organisational change is continuous, it's happening through gestures and responses, through conversations, through the making of symbolic interactions and drawing into different meanings from them. And then, kind of linking back to what Joe was saying and questions of inclusion and experience, if we look at organizations in this way, then we start to realize that meaning is something that's socially constructed, and it's different depending on who we are and how we experience something and the context we are in. So in that sense, we need to focus on how that social construction takes place. So just in summary, these perspectives, they change the way we interact and intervene in organizational change and design processes. Sorry, this is moving all over the place. Joe,
it's my fault, it's my fault.
So participation is learning to work with what emerges, and that leads methodologically to developmental types of evaluation. Have you've got control of the screen now, Joe, clearly?
Yes. All right, so I'm going to continue with some of the theoretical, I guess, drivers that shape our thinking around participation and evaluation. And I've got 4 particular influences here. Michel Foucault, who was responsible for using critical theory to analyze social structures and social contexts and social behaviors. Foucault talked about processes whereby ordinary people are pretty much enslaved by the system through what he called disciplinary techniques. These are techniques that the state particularly uses to classify, categorize, and punish people. Governmentality is the apparatus of government, the way in which government acquires structures in order to control. Normalization is how the tools of discipline are imposed on people to make sure they conform to norms. And responsibilization is a technique and a tool of discipline, whereby people become responsible for their own actions and behaviors in the absence of the state actually doing anything for them. Elinor Ostrom was a big pioneer in thinking about socio-ecological systems and complex systems. And as Juliet was saying earlier, how it's pretty much useless to think about individual actions affecting anything in a system as complex as an urbanscape. If you do one reaction, it has sometimes unpredictable reactions, responses, tessellations, that can be almost infinite. So Ostrom was thinking about how you understand how that operates, and she came up with the idea of, well, systems that are actually self-organizing. There's a myth that it's the opposite of what Foucault was attributing systems to. It's a myth that that people cannot organize and self-organize. They do it all the time. And they do it through creating a common pools of resources that they can then exchange and use for each other to do things within their community. They do it through implicit rather than explicit trust and collaboration systems. They trade off things. So sometimes if you want the community, if you want the city to survive and prosper, you have to trade off some of your own objectives, some of your own advantages to accommodate the objectives and advantages of somebody else. Donald Winnicott, I'm stuck again. I brought Donald Winnicott in because, as some of the audience may know, Winnicott was hugely influential in thinking about how the child development process operates. And the big insight that he came up with was that in the transition from a child who was completely dependent, particularly on the mother, although both parents, that transition from total dependency to autonomy, becoming a thinking and acting self, can only be done through what he called the holding environment. And biologically, the holding environment initially is the womb. It then becomes the space, the home space often, where children can be creative. They can play in a safe and nurturing space that doesn't threaten, doesn't accuse, doesn't inflict punishment. And so one of the ideas that we've been working with in this space of participation is, how can you create a transitional space, a holding environment which enables the nurturing of creativity. And it's one of the things that Designscapes really was set up to do. How can we engineer a space with, to be honest, a small amount of cash, small amount of money, that can allow people to experiment in ways that they may not otherwise be able to. And the last one, Paulo Freire, who was hugely influential, particularly in South America, in the favelas, in places where people were utterly deprived, that poverty is extreme. How can you create, again, a space in which people who are extremely dispossessed and extremely disadvantaged, how can you create a space where they can actually learn things? They can, again, use their creativity to make things different and better for themselves. So these are the kind of influences from the different philosophical traditions that that kind of shape the way we think about participation and evaluation. And then there's some practical resources and drivers that that we've been looking at and feeding into our work that actually tell you how to do it in practice. Fourth generation evaluation. This was quite radical when it first arrived at the end of the 80s, and what Guber and Lincoln, who basically developed this fourth generation idea of evaluation, was saying was that the most important objective of evaluation is to give a voice to people who don't have a voice. The most important thing you can do in evaluation is to allow and enable a space for people without power to actually have an influence on the evolution of an action or a project, and to have an influence on interpreting how those results should be used. We have other influences, value-based commitments to local community development, the idea that in order to work within a community, your projects, your theory of change has to be based on values. And participatory evaluation is closely linked up to action research, which is actually experimenting with complex things in a social complex, taking them apart, seeing how they work and they don't work, and putting them back together again. So action research is a cycle of problem definition, planning to change the problem, acting on the plan, seeing whether the plan worked, evaluating the outcomes and impacts, then reflecting on the evidence from the evaluation so you can get back to the problem again and revisit it with a new understanding of how it works. And if you do that in practice, this is how you would do it in a design thinking space. Scenarios building, life world analysis, construct a theory of change, create participatory mechanisms to involve stakeholders who can then co-produce an action plan to change what they want to change, implement the plan through community-led actions, observe what happens, get stakeholders and users to have a voice in the evaluation and the assessment of whether the plan worked, and then organize similar participation groups to reflect on the results. So I guess what I'm saying is that throughout the whole cycle of a project and the projects that have been funded in Designscapes, it's this constant theme of getting stakeholders involved, users involved, people without a voice involved, so they have a co-creation and co-production and co-evaluation role in what you're doing. I'm going to use an example of how this is done in practice with a project that we did a couple of years ago called Share My City. And it was all about trying to embed these tools in the actual practice of action research. So we were working in 3 cities, in London, in Perugia, in Italy, and in a place in Spain that I can never pronounce. Valladolid. Help me.
Valladolid.
Valladolid. Thank you.
It's a mouthful. Yeah.
It is a mouthful. All right. So we applied the tools that you'll find to a large extent in the Designscapes toolbox to do stuff which has an action research objective in real life. Life world analysis life world analysis is actually trying to identify the lived experience of real people. It's what happens below the system, and the lived experience of people is hardly ever captured and used and understood and applied in practice. The holding environment, as I've said earlier, this comes from Winnicott. It was an attempt to create a safe space that you could support creativity in these three communities. I'm stuck again. Oh, design-led innovation with its 5 stages of empathize. Get an empathy of the situation, define what the problems are, come up with out-of-the-box ideas to solve the problems, produce a prototype that embeds all the ideas that you've had, test it, evaluate it, and learn from it. And this stuff at the bottom, this is what Michel Foucault called marginal practices. It's stuff that goes on outside the system, outside the mainstream. So the trainer is the first trainer that went on the global market that actually used materials that have been sourced from the developing world, where the people who were producing materials were actually paid a living wage. So it's stuff that is out of the box. It's stuff that is radical and disruptive. And then all that stuff goes together in the action research and participatory approach, where you involve powerless people, you involve people who don't have a voice in the actions you take and the problems you're trying to solve. So Share My City was one way of doing this, and we took some of the tools that you'll find in the Designscapes toolbox. Cultural probe is a version of life world analysis. You actually go into the community, you work with the community, and the community actually captures, working with you, its own lived experience. How does it actually operate in everyday situations, and what does that mean for change? Co-creation workshop is a very basic tool where, you would get stakeholders involved, citizens involved, people on the margins involved, people who don't have a voice involved. So their voice could be expressed and they could collectively come together to come up with a collective sense-making idea of what the problem is and how you can change it. Stakeholder map, which is also in the toolbox, is the way in which you identify who the stakeholders you need to involve are, what are their characteristics, what are their needs, and how likely will they be to participate and contribute something of value to your project. And then, as I've said, theory of change puts it all together. It defines the presenting problem you want to solve. It defines the change that you want to have at the end of the project, its impact, and the steps in between, the actions you take, the outputs they produce, the outcomes that are associated with the use of the outputs. So we put all this together in this particular project. So Share My City was funded under a Prevention Against Crime program by the European Commission. It worked in 3 cities, as I said earlier. The presenting problem, which we start our theory of change with, was that drugs and alcohol are creating high levels of crime and antisocial behavior in what are called nighttime economies. So nighttime economies are places in cities where all the clubs are, all the bars are, all the nightlife is, and all of the tension and conflict. So our theory of change was, okay, so we have a problem with antisocial behavior and crime in the center of cities. Our theory of how you would solve that was that, well, if you increase the shared use of space, so you get stakeholders participating in plans and actions to change how the city centre operates, then that is likely to reduce crime. And that was our theory. We worked in London, we worked in Perugia, we worked in Valladolid. Thank you. So Perugia is a classic medieval city. It's got a huge student population, about 35,000 students. As you can see in the top photograph, they all congregate in the middle of the square in this medieval town. They all get completely drunk and take loads of drugs, and that creates lots of tensions. Perugia was infamous for the Meredith Kircher trial, where one of the students was brutally murdered, and this this created an international incident that went on for a long time. So it put into the international perspective issues around crime, drugs, and alcohol, and students in a particular situation. In London, we were working in Hackney, which is where I am now, particularly around issues around the use of young children below the age of 16 in the drug production and delivery process. So what happens in parts of London, where I am now, is under 16s are likely to have much less criminal sanctions against them if they carry drugs and firearms and weapons for the dealers than they would be if they were over 16. So there's a major problem about young people being involved in as drugs mules, in firearms offences, in shootings and stabbings and so on. So all of this stuff we were working with a participatory angle. The assumption was, if we get all of the people, different stakeholders involved, all of whom have different perspectives on what crime is and how it works, all have often conflicting perspectives. The police perspective is very different from the young people's perspective, which is very different from a shop owner's perspective. If we put those together and do some sense making, then maybe we can get a solution to the problem. So that's what we did. Classic action research. What's the problem? What's the plan? Think out the box. How do we fix it? How do we get people involved from all of the stakeholder groups in the city to work on the solution? And so we did stuff like we organised strani eventi, strange events, stuff that was completely out of the box. I mentioned earlier marginal practices, stuff that doesn't happen. The trainer built in the developing world. So we were doing out of the box stuff, strange events like in Perugia. We were doing outdoor chess, so people would play chess in the streets. We would do 24-hour flamenco festivals. We would have philosophy debates in the middle of the square. In London, we did similar things where we had the National Youth Orchestra of Kurdistan with a punk band in the same venue. It was mixing things up, creating havoc, creating disruption. Outdoor ball games, street graffiti, drama, plays that actually took place in factories and along the streets. So they were actually being developed in real time by citizens and people on the margins. So that's what we did. And it kind of works. So I think it's back to you, Juliet.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so I'm just going to finish in talking about sort of, in a way, some of the hows or of what it means to practice participation, and again talking from a sort of organisational consultancy perspective. What are practical tools that might support and enable stakeholder sort of participation, and thinking of some of those kind of aspects of consultancy as what it means to kind of create a holding environment, as Joe says, when we're working within the projects. What are the skills that might be required that help in doing that? So yeah, in applying this kind of approach to your Designscapes projects, taking an organizational perspective, we might start to think that or suggest that Designscapes projects could see themselves as a fractal of the urban problem that they are trying to solve. So they are embedded within the urban society, and therefore they're going to be kind of importing some of the behaviors, the dynamics of the society, which is the sort of, the urban environment that is their context. So this implies then the need to replicate that urban system in the project team by including a wider group of stakeholders at all levels of the system, from local government to project beneficiaries, so that within the project itself there is a diversity of representation and voice, as Joe was saying, that somehow has a relationship between the kind of wider environment. And the kind of hypothesis or the method of working is that by learning about that wider system and experimenting with those fractal interactions, so we can notice the psychodynamics within the project team, what are the kinds of things that are happening within our project, and what do they tell us about what is going on in the environment in which we're working in. So this is a kind of we use the language use of self by looking at what's happening at the sort of smaller level. We can get better understandings about what is happening more widely, but we need to have included elements of that urban environment. So practical tools. So by practical tools, I mean sort of ways of working in an organizational way or in a group way. Joe's already mentioned some, kind of in a way disruptive methodologies that bring together those different elements of working, of life world spaces of participation and disruption. There's also open space and world cafes, which are facilitated processes. So by facilitation, that creation of safe environments, holding environments where people can experiment, exchange views, take part in processes of democratic inquiry. Search and future conferences, which are bigger meetings of that level that perhaps look forward, where participants work together to identify shared visions of the future, and bringing more into sort of methodologies or of the present day. Theory U is a global community. It's a global program that is available freely to anybody who wants to use it, that works in this from sensing to sort of co-shaping way of looking to change and organizational change. Action learning sets, which involve stakeholders, can be used in participatory action research, and enabling those spaces for conversation. So again, the working out loud, public engagement, blogs, forum theatre, all of these are tools and methods that I suppose coming more from that organizational social change perspective, but that could be used in terms of the design community. So this slide then takes that on and just opens up questions that when we work with participation, what also do we need to notice, or what perhaps are skills that we might want to think about developing or bringing into our project teams, perhaps beyond some of the technical or academic or design skills that are kind of more common and prevalent within the Designscapes communities. So in here, just bringing an example of what it means to work with groups. So questions of developing emotional and organizational intelligence, and developing that ability to read the group and to understand the wider system psychodynamics and what they are telling us. And this really relates to kind of, what is it, how do we notice things like who we include, who we don't include within our work, who's getting left out of the projects, why, and looking at kind of, manifestations and examples of how those, how stakeholders are included, or how they show up, what kind of things are they saying or are they not saying. So looking at groups is starting to look at what's happening. Is the group highly dependent? So the illustration is showing a sort of example of a very dependency orientated group that is looking for leadership, is looking for a particular authority figure to tell them what to do, as opposed to perhaps the kind of some of the more participatory, autonomous ways in which groups can behave. Groups can be very emotionally driven, so the emotions drive the task, but they forget to think. They think at the expense of their emotions. These are all sort of dynamics that can relate to a wider anxiety or sense of concern or loss of that holding environment. They lose sight of task. They try to control change. So going back to this way of looking at the world, I can make the change happen myself, you know, from my either my project perspective or my individual perspective, rather than contributing to a more sensitive, iterative, managerial sort of approach to change. And they can lose sight of other critical boundaries. So in a way, it's developing an ability to experience, to become aware of the irrational aspects of organizational life, both in self and in other, and the ability to start thinking about the meaning of these experiences to create an understanding and to support groups in their work. So what just trying to infer here is this sense of what are those skills around noticing, understanding what is happening, and that is relevant data to your project as a whole. So other aspects of systems awareness are working at the boundary, or understanding that boundaries of are critical data points to what might be happening in your project or in the wider system. So what do you notice? Boundaries are geographical and social. Where am I? What sort of place is this? Who are the people in this place? Is my project team all women? Is it all men? Is it white? Is it BME? Does it have any relationship to the kind of issues and problems that we're trying to look at? What happens when we cross boundaries? Are we a very closed system? Are we open to the environment around? When we let the environment in, what kind of feelings and responses do we put up? And where are the organizational boundaries, and how are they kind of held? Do I take up a gatekeeper role? What's happening when people walk into my project, or that type of thing? And all of these aspects of boundary are things that tell us something about our project. And if we then think that our project is telling us something, it's a fractal of the wider environment. This is why it's important to kind of look at these aspects as part of our work. So just then finishing, it sort of brings the whole thing together, you know, pitfalls of what we've been presenting in terms of approaches and how to survive them. It's a very potted list. So people, you know, participatory evaluation can be viewed as subjective and not scientific because it's involving people, it's qualitative. To mitigate against that, we triangulate, we compare different types of evidence, and by piecing those different types of evidence together, we start to again get a kind of clearer and wider and broader picture. Users and stakeholders can be very difficult to engage, so we talk about participation and co-creation, and people don't turn up. So what do we sort of put in place to keep the community involved and to involve people? And how do we work with the information around how people show up? This ethnographic and qualitative data can be difficult to collect. So one important aspect around participation is that it takes time and resources, and this is very true. It's hard work. It's hard work involving people, and it's important to say that, and it takes time. which is in a way why people kind of flight into that mode of I'll just go it alone, because it's so much easier to just go it alone rather than engage stakeholders in your data collection activities. So we can have stakeholder conflict, and in a way this is why we're also suggesting the use of participatory methods that help to promote alignment, to work through conflict, that offer people different places in which to experiment with those different positions of the different groups. Focus on inclusion leads to exclusion. So this is the ultimate kind of paradox, really, is, you know, someone, if we're thinking about inclusive practices and we're thinking about groups, there's always going to be somebody who's left out. So how do we deal with that paradox? You know, where do we draw the boundary, and how do we work with those questions of who's in and who's out? We can get lost in the task. So going back to the boundary side, the task becomes so we become so focused of it, our system closes and we lose sight of the external environment. And then that leads to wanting to be in control and wanting, rather than that delicate management of the project. So that finishes this part. We were going to go into questions for group work. There are some final slides on next steps. So Vasilis, over to you. Would you like to ask any questions before we go into the next steps?
Yeah. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
okay.
Very well.
One of the questions that I had since the beginning is, okay, when you, first of all, I have technical background, complete technical background, so we're talking about different disciplines here that we're trying to bridge together. One of the things that we always come across when we're designing new products, new services, etc., in the ICT domain, is the question: have you validated your business idea through stakeholders, through people that are going to use the expected outcome of a technical work, and not to understand, let's say, the visibility to the wider groups, whether this new prototype will be acceptable from the stakeholders, etc. So in this pyramid that you presented in the beginning, with the 3 steps that lead the design enabling innovation, where would you position that? Is it something that comes, that runs across the 3 steps? Is it something that belongs to, so I mean that the business validation is something that should run always as an activity, something that should be belongs to not to evaluation, but to evaluation of a prototype, but to the validation of your design thinking approaches?
I can start, Joe. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm starting perhaps because I've just been in full flow, but to me that relates to this question of how we view organizations and organizational change. So if we come at a problem from the perspective of this is a problem, but I haven't really spent the time identifying who the problem relates to and whose the problem is. So in a way, the sooner in which you can involve the stakeholders and the people who are affected by that problem in the creation of it, yeah, the more likely it is to be one that is going to the working with the solution, or the design solution, is going to be relevant to them. But the challenge often is that we come up with ideas and we're coming up with them from a place of, you know, not a place of participation. But Joe might, well, that's a sort of organisational perspective. Joe might have a more of evaluation perspective to that.
Yeah, for me, the design thinking model is often presented as a linear thing. So you start off with the empathize stage, where you get an understanding of what's the problem on the ground. You then define the problem after you've absorbed what the problem is from the perspective of other people. You then you ideate it, you come up with solutions that are disruptive and think out the box. You prototype it and you test it. But in reality, that doesn't work that way. It's a constant iterative cycle. So in the real world, if you use the classic design thinking model, you keep going back in loops. So you may find that when you get to the stage where you're coming up with some ideas for a prototype, that they don't work, or they don't represent some of the perspectives of the users. So you go back to the empathize stage, you go back to the ideate stage, and you're constantly doing these cyclical iterative feedback loops. And I think that's the only way it does work. In the same way, if you take a participatory action research and a participatory evaluation model, it's exactly the same process, where you start off with what's the problem, engage users in it, get their thinking, co-create solutions to it, come up with a plan, put the plan into action, observe how it's operating. If it's not working, you go back again and you modify the plan. So I think we have a tendency to use tools like, business model canvas, which is a very linear, compartmentalized framework of what's my prototype, what's the markets, how do the users operate. But that's never how it happens in practice. So there's always these iterations, and there has to be. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, one of the Designscapes toolbox is a really, really good set of tools that cover a huge spectrum of possibilities and situations. But for me, the most important and the most useful tool is actually a structured co-creation workshop, where and you use that again. You don't just use it the once at the beginning. You use it constantly throughout these iterations of how the project operates and evolves. And it's a really simple and very effective tool for at every stage where, say, you have a milestone, then you consult, you co-consult, you co-produce, and you co-create.
But what you I'm allowed to actually to say many questions, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Because of the matter of timing, that's why I'm asking this. What you just said about the repetition of this is something that in the technical world aligns with the concept of agile development or DevOps. Okay, so in that sense, which is the right time for these co-creation workshops that you mentioned in an agile process? Is it something that should come frequently after, so we say, I don't know if you are aware of the concepts like epic sprints, etc., the agile development process. Yeah. So what's your suggestion about the organization of these co-creation workshops with your targets, your participatory groups? Is the timing, I mean, okay, you can organize your development through an agile process that may be evolved in many sprints that belong to certain epics, etc. So is there any best practice when you should engage in this process, this co-creation participatory workshops with your stakeholders?
That's the bit that I was trying to explain, but not very well. But in my mind, the sooner you work with and involve the wider community and the stakeholders, the better. But then, as Joe says, you also continue to do it, and you continue to go back to the stakeholders and the wider community to consult with and to test and iterate how it is the work is emerging. Because if you don't do it at the beginning, the problem is coming from, it's not coming from their space, it's coming from a different space altogether.
Yeah, it's obvious that you can't do a continual co-creation workshop. It's impossible. In practice, how I do it is I tend to link these things to key milestones in the evolution of the project. So I'm doing one at the moment, which is quite technical. It's to build an observatory. It's a data observatory to map and analyze the health, and it links back to my example, Share My City. So it's to build an observatory and we're producing a data dashboard. So the data dashboard gives you a snapshot of the health of the nighttime economy in a city at any one time, and it's based on stuff like the economic health, vitality, and so on. And it's really complicated. So we started it with right at the beginning when we did what I call rapid appraisal. You actually get out on the street and you talk to people. Well, we did before COVID set in, and then it made it impossible. But you go on the street, you do vox pop, you do interviews with people who are coming out of a bar or coming out of a restaurant, and ask them questions about why they're there and what are they doing and things like that. So that's the life world analysis. It's the rapid appraisal, and then you put that into that's the empathize stage. You get an empathy with the problem and how it is in the lived experience, and then you collect the data, and a lot of that is stakeholder mapping. So we actually use the Designscapes stakeholder map tool out of the Designscapes toolbox to identify who were the key voices we needed to represent, how powerful were they, how committed are they likely to be to this project, this observatory. And when we got the data, the next milestone is, okay, we construct a storyboard and a mock-up of what this looks like, and then you have a co-creation workshop. So the stakeholders, the users, everybody with an interest will interrogate the storyboard. It's a very simple storyboard. It has six acts. This is how it looks. We have personas. So we do archetype user personas and what their needs are. The co-creation workshop looks at the personas, looks at the storyboard, and then goes, well, this doesn't look right. Then with the next iteration, we go back, get more data until we're now currently going to arrive at the first prototype, at which point we'll do another co-creation workshop to interrogate the thing again and kind of try and test it to destruction. And in practice, I think that's how it works. You link these things to the key milestones of the evolution of how the project is supposed to develop.
Okay. And one last thing, in your slides, I think it was you, Juliet, that present that. You mentioned something about being aware of your environment with resources, economy. I don't remember which slide was that. Is this something similar to a pest analysis that we're doing in?
Yeah, pestle analysis.
Pest.
Yeah, pest. Yeah. Yeah. I suppose it is, but I suppose what I was also trying to introduce is this idea that organisations and certainly the projects within Designscapes are also organisations of forms. groups tend to, you know, they're always acting within a wider environment, and they tend to import, you know, or bring in aspects, patterns, behaviors, or reactions to that wider environment. So it's very important to understand how you are as an organization in relation to your wider environment. So it's slightly different from a pest analysis, which is kind of looking at that from a more strategic,
Okay.
perhaps developmental approach. It's saying that if we can be aware of the relationship between our group, our temporary organisation, our project, and the environment, and what is happening, between the two, that gives us important information for what's going on in the project. So, I mean, a good example of that is Black Lives Matter at the moment. You know, what impact is that happening on the way that we think about who we are as individuals, around our interactions with organisations, and how is that then affecting the groups, the organisations in which we all work? These kinds of emotions of our social systems do get imported into the smaller organisations that we work in. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Do you have any? We've got to the end. Yeah, there were a few extra slides which are really more offering some resources to the to what we've been talking about, Vasilis. So, Alyssa, do we present the slides along with the recording?
Yeah, we will offer everybody the slides on the recording.
Okay, maybe the slides is a separate resource so that you have those as well. Yeah. And they include references really to and some suggested next steps around experimentation with working with stakeholders and, you know, theory of change.
Great. Can I make one last really practical question that I also have gotten from the community, and I think is a worry for everybody? Do you have tips on engaging people in participation or even in user research? Do you guys have experiences from projects on successful ways to engage maybe tough crowds? It's always, I don't think everybody has the final answer, but just in case.
Well, engage the hard to engage.
Yeah, in the places where they are hard to engage. Yeah.
Really, really hard. I'm probably going to sound a bit abstract, but it's all about getting credibility. If you don't have credibility, you don't have trust. And if you don't have credibility and trust, you don't have engagement. It's quite simple. So I mean, I work a lot with the very hard to engage, very hard to reach. And the only way that's worked in my experience is if you have mediators, you have people who can make the bridge, who have the trust and the credibility. And if you start with that, then you take a back seat to it. And the mediators are typically from the environments in which the target group is. So they're actually, I mean, to give you a good example, we're working it links back to the Share My City example. We're working in really seriously heavy duty areas in London where with the knife crime, the gun crime, drugs, and the gangs. And the people who get us access to the really extremely marginalised people are, for example, ex-gang members. So reformed ex-gang members who are now, you know, they're actually pillars of the society. They're looked up to, they're role models, they're kind of mentors. And that's, for me, that is the only really successful way in which you can do this. And if you get that buy-in, then if you're lucky and you're good and you're successful, you then get the momentum. It gains traction, and if one kind of young person then gets involved in the project,
Yeah.
it has the same effect. It amplifies the mediator effect, and more join, and then you get the momentum, you get the buy-in, and then it begins to generate its own energy. And I think that's how it's done, but it's really, really hard. I'm not saying it's easy, because it isn't.
No, but I think it's a great tip, just finding a mediator. Yeah.
And it also works with the opposite extreme, the stakeholders who come from civic society. It's often quite hard to get buy-in from the commune, or the local authority, or the mayor's office, or whatever. But that's a different set of issues. That's normally time and money.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you to our audience